Okay, welcome everybody. Thanks for joining today. My name is Matt Sturm. The topic of today's conversation is what is masculinity? So thanks to each of you for joining me over Zoom. Pleasure to have you here. We're also live streaming over Facebook, so hi to all the folks on Facebook. To the people on Zoom, if you have any questions along the way at any point, please feel free to type them into the chat and I'll pick them up along the way and we will talk about it as we go. So your comments are totally welcome. And with that, we will just dive right in. I want to start by sharing a little bit about myself. So I'm talking here today about masculinity because it's a topic that I've been passionate about for about the last 10 years. And I've been on a real journey in myself to discover what masculinity means. I teach around this topic. I've been leading men's retreats for the last 4 or 5 years. And for me, in terms of inhabiting a male form, getting to dig into what masculinity is has been one of like the most healing and growth-oriented places of exploration in my entire life. And in terms of what we can do for our society and the planet today, getting conscious about what it means to be a man, finding out how we relate to it, and then showing up from a place of integrity is, from my perspective, one of the most important and most impactful things we can be doing with our time and energy. I also want to share that talking about masculinity is complicated. There are social factors. There are a lot of different perspectives out there. And in addition to just being like a topic of interest, it forms part of our identity. You know, gender more broadly, whether you identify as a man or not, gender is part of who we are. And so when we talk about what masculinity is or means, we're also filtering it through the lens of, and who am I in relationship to this? And so for that reason, I really hold this, I guess, kind of gently, preciously, that I'm not here to tell you who you are or what masculinity means for you. I'm here to share my field notes and to tell you what I've come up with and to be in a conversation with you in an ongoing discovery of what this means and what it can be. So the way that I approach these conversations is to be brave, to share what I see, what's my truth, to speak out, to be humble, meaning not thinking that I have all of the answers or the right answers, or even that I know necessarily more than any of you do. I'm just here sharing what is arising for me and what my studies have brought me to. And then to be dedicated, which means to show up, to be here and have the conversation, even if it's uncomfortable or even if it's stretching me. So with that in mind, let's dive right in. And here's where I want to start. When your heart naturally and innately recognizes masculinity, that is the true masculine. When your heart naturally and innately recognizes masculinity, that is the true masculine. So let's just take a few breaths here. And I invite you to feel into a recent time in your experience where either you felt masculinity within yourself or you witnessed masculinity in somebody else. And just take a moment to tune into how that arose for you. And I also just want to say that if nothing comes up, if you don't have this internal reference, that's okay too. But I imagine that most of us are able to find something, either in our experience or what we witness, where our bodies, our emotions, our intuition, our felt sense said, oh, that's masculinity. And this is really what we want to refine and tune into and clarify. What is it that we're responding to? How do we know? What is this thing that's arising in us where we're saying that that's masculinity? And I start here. And I want to add that all other perspectives in the presentation I'm about to give are footnotes to this statement. You finding your truth innately, naturally, in your own center is the result that we're going for. All of the theories, all of the social constructions, everything else, let's put that in service to what's arising truly in my experience. So that being said, I want to look at the layers of our psycho-spiritual experience. What are the layers of consciousness that we kind of grade through? And then we'll take a look at how masculinity and actually how gender maps onto these layers of experience. I'm going to start at the bottom and work my way up. The gross layer of consciousness is our physical bodies. It's 3D matter and form. The next layer on top of that, the next realm of consciousness on top of that, is our individual and collective identity and expression. So the thoughts that I have, the personality that I have, my character traits, who I see myself as and who I express myself as in connection with others, we could say that's in the subtle realm. That's the next layer up. Above that, we have archetypes. These are patterns of meaning that are more universal. They're symbols that all humans can tap into. An example of a masculine archetype would be the wild man. We see it across different cultures, across different periods of history, and throughout different people's dreams, this symbol shows up. Going even higher towards more unified spirit, we have the high causal realm where there are primal polarities, light and dark, good and evil. In addition, these are the highest differentiations of spirit before we get to non-dual consciousness or just pure oneness. So those first differentiations, that happens in the high causal realm. Now, let's use these realms and let's look at how gender expresses or constellates through each of them. So the first thing to note on this table that I'm putting up is that I'm not listing just two, the divine masculine and the feminine. I'm also including a third, the androgen. So, the side note here is that this is my perspective. It may not be yours, and I don't need it to be yours, but consider. So we'll start at the bottom of the chart and we'll work our way up. At the gross level of consciousness, we have biology, physiology, or physical form. That for men is maleness, for women is femaleness, and then certain percentage of humans are hermaphroditic. They're born with both. And there are other humans who transition along the way throughout the course of their life, transsexual. So it's the space, not fully one and not fully the other, but both or neither or somewhere in between. At the subtle level, we have the masculine genders, feminine genders, and then the queer, transgender, third gender, kind of a catch-all bucket for everything else. Now, gender includes my identity, who I see myself as, so I identify as a man. It includes my expression, which is the social cues, how I dress, how I speak, how I cut my hair, that are interpreted by other people in my culture, and then they reflect back, yes, that is your gender, that is your manness or maleness or masculinity. I have genders here because we don't understand, now we understand that there are many versions of masculinity. There's not just one gender across all cultures and all times, that this has changed and shifted. And even within a culture, there are these subgroups of how masculinity expresses. So machismo in Latin culture is different than, pick any other culture and a word that expresses their masculinity. There are different expressions here. Moving up to the next level on the graph, causal level, we have the masculine archetypes, feminine archetypes, and androgynous archetypes. So I gave the example of the wild man, the great mother, the golden boy. There are many, many different archetypes that fall within masculinity. King, the warrior, the father. These archetypes, properly understood, are universal symbols that we put our culturally specific myths, values, and stories on top of and interpret through. But the symbols are believed to be part of the collective unconscious that we are all able to tap into. Symbols are universal. The reason why we think that is because we see these same symbols showing up for all people across different religions, across different cultures, different periods of history, and in particular through dream imagery. It shows up again and again and again. Next layer up, on the high causal realm, we have primal polarities. So the divine masculine and the divine feminine, or just, sacred masculine and sacred feminine. And then also the divine androgen. And I'm going to take a moment to talk about that one. Actually now, that's where we're going next, what that is. So here's a quote from an author who I like, Jenny Wade. She says, the divine hermaphrodite may be the most universally recognized symbol of spirit, which is kind of a bold claim. But she backs it up by saying virtually every theistic religion starts with an original being who embodies both male and female. And because this shows up in different religions, across cultures, across epochs of history, we have reason to believe that it is one of these archetypal primal symbols in consciousness. Two examples here. Western civilization, so the one on the left, this is from the Middle Ages, from an alchemical text, so alchemy, medieval alchemy. We have the divine hermaphrodite, or in my language, the divine androgen. And from Hindu culture, we have similar, a figure that is both male and female at the same time. So I'm not going to go too much more in depth on this, except just to simply recognize that there is not just a plurality, or not just a binary, masculine and feminine, but a plurality, that there are actually many, and that masculinity fits within the context of these three high archetypes, high causal realm fields. The way that I imagine these, or that I picture these, is through this diagram. So we can imagine that the psyche, that our consciousness, the totality of our consciousness, has some type of symbolic shape. And in general, the masculine principle is pictured and imaged as being above the apex. It's the ascent to the top of the mountain. In general, across cultures, and symbolically, the feminine goes below. She goes down into the void, into the yoni, into the cave. The upward and downward triangles create a circle. And the circumference of the circle is where the androgen lives. And that is the plurality of all the different expressions that are both male and female, neither male nor female, third gender, everything in between. Each one of these, the apex, the void below, and the horizon, offer an access point to the center. And the center is that place of unity, the place of oneness. When we get to the center, we connect with the sacred, so to speak. And this language comes not just from Jungian psychology, It also comes from our studies of mythology and looking at how indigenous cultures throughout the ages have accessed the sacred through initiations and rites of passage. So this particular image, this doodle, this graphic that I had is here just to help put into perspective how the masculine fits in. That shape shows up in different religions. So here's the Babylonian depiction of the universe with a North Pole, a South Pole, and a circumference. And for them, the sacred lies in the center. It also shows up in the shapes of galaxies. So it's both enacted within the psyche and it shows up in our physical universe around us. So now let's look at how masculinity works together with the feminine. My claim here is that the masculine defines itself in opposition, polarity, and contrast to the feminine. The masculine is what polarizes with the feminine. I go on, so my next position is that there is no objective or universal masculine trait. It is always contextually dependent. So from unity, from oneness, we have a polarity, a differentiation. And whatever the context is, light and dark, emissive and receptive, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, that's how both masculine and feminine know each other at their core. But it is contextual. It can show up in many, many different ways. And it's through the contrast, through the polarity, that they define themselves. So let's make this a little bit more specific. I went through and looked at different definitions of what masculine and feminine polarities are, both within our culture and through other cultures and religious traditions. And based on this graph, I'm making the claim that there is no universal masculine trait and no universal feminine trait. It's only contextually dependent. So let's take a look at these polarities. Western cultural norm, we have men as provider, women as nurturer. There is a gender theory called biological determinism, which says because we are primates and we have instincts, that determines what men act like and how women are. And so men are seen as more aggressive and women are seen as more passive. A contemporary psychological theory called object relation theory, which is based on attachment, says that the masculine drive is autonomous and the feminine drive is communion. Men are here to individuate and women are here to collect and come together. Prominent men's work author and activist David Data, among many, because he talks about a lot of different things, but one of his main frameworks is the masculine is structure and the feminine is flow. So by the masculine holding the frame, it gives the feminine space to dance. Indian philosophy called Samkhya says that masculine or Shiva is consciousness, Purusha, and the feminine, Shakti, is form or power, Prakriti. In a very closely related tradition, Tibetan Buddhism, the masculine is seen as skillful means. This could be considered penetration. And the feminine aspect is perfect insight. So when you look through all of these and we kind of layer them together, and there are many, many more that we could look at, there's not necessarily consistency between them. Just take the bottom two. In the Indian Samkhya philosophy, we have consciousness versus form and power. And beneath that, we have the masculine being skillful means, which is more like action, and the feminine being perfect insight, which is more like consciousness. Even in these two closely related traditions, there's not consistency. In fact, they're almost swapped. Similarly, provider and nurturer, the top line, let's compare that one to David Deda's structure and flow. The provider is the one who is bringing in resources to the family. And the nurturer is the one who has the nest and holds the container. So these two, which are both born largely out of Western culture, also seem to be not totally aligned. But individually, they make sense. Contextually, between themselves, they line up. Oh yeah, in this context, the masculine is structure and the feminine is flow. In this other socially constructed context, yeah, men are providers and women are nurturers. It makes sense. So the masculine and the feminine understand themselves and define themselves through these sets of polarities. What that polarity is up to us. It's up to our imagination. It's up to our cultures to get to create. Some of them are handed down to us, and some of them are still being explored and expanded upon today. From my perspective, the only limit to these polarities is our imagination. Now, there is something, there we go, really cool that happens when the masculine and the feminine polarize with each other. And I'm drawing here on my background in sacred sexuality and looking at how desire is created between a masculine and a feminine partner. So there is a whole school of thought on polarity in relationship, that by inhabiting these different poles, it creates desire, that spark of contraction, and it keeps the relationship alive. From my observation, there are actually generally two sets of polarities that a partnership or a scene between two people embodies. Sometimes we're in one polarity, and sometimes we're in another polarity. I'm going to pause here and see if there's a question. Thank you, Venga. I'm happy that you are connected to this image. Great. So if I'm connecting with my partner and I'm choosing to inhabit a set of masculine polarities, in this case, again, there are many, many, many you could choose from, but here's the example that we'll use. In this case, I would choose to be presence and penetration, sometimes one, sometimes the other. My partner in the feminine pole would be in her power or in surrender. And so that the way that this works is we choose one set, and it can be, it can be naturally arising. It doesn't have to be like, okay, now we're going to do this. But imagine that we inhabit she in her power, in her expression, in her fullness, and me in my presence, in witnessing. That's a really juicy place to be. And then at some point, that will kind of apex, that'll reach its crescendo. And then something else will want to happen. And then we'll switch into a different set of polarities where instead of being in presence to all of her power, I can then move into penetration, which can happen on a physical level. But what I really mean by penetration is taking the whole field of experience and focusing it in here and saying, this is where we're going. So penetration has a quality of focus, and it has a quality of honing in. And then my partner can meet that deepening into experience by surrendering, by welcoming, by allowing. And that will run its course. And the deeper she surrenders into it, inevitably that will naturally bring up more of her power, more of her expression, more of her aliveness, Shakti. And so we can play in this dynamo. And I call it a dynamo because this wheel can start to turn. And the more it turns, the stronger it gets, and it becomes its own emergent entity, its own emergent flow of experience between the two of us. And so in this sense, there's an interplay, and desire is the energy that flows back and forth between the two. So this is my perspective on how to engage in polarities together with a romantic partner, but also in any place where you might intentionally be bringing in the masculine and feminine interplay in your life. Doesn't have to be sexual. And that by inhabiting these types of polarities, we create a really fun, expressive, creative experience that's alive, it's emergent between two people, between two entities. And so the more that this flows, the more energy, and it's like a positive feedback cycle, it builds. And so this brings me to my next point, which is around cycles. Question here, can the same be tapped by switching the polarity within the self? The answer is yes. From my perspective, we all have masculine and feminine and androgen within us. These are all contextually dependent. So I can choose to be the feminine. I can choose different definitions for what the feminine is. I can run this wheel simply inside of myself, or I can run it together with a partner or with a group of people. So the more that we study this, the more agency that we gain, the more we're able to start to explore this with intention. Yeah, great question. But so the next place that I want to go is, a lot of these conversations are around polarity. Simple polarity for me is something, but we want to take the next step, which is two polarities, which creates a dynamo. And the dynamo really is a cycle. And for me, life in general moves in cycles. That's part of the natural intelligence of our universe, of human life, and how the cosmos propagates is in cycles. And so when we get a cyclic view, a cycling view of the masculine and feminine interacting together, that's an even higher order understanding. So the cycles don't always have to run positively. They can run negatively, scarcity cycles. So I have a couple of examples here of how the masculine and feminine can work not in uplifting each other, but in kind of against each other and cut off from each other. And the specifics of what's in these cycles is not meant to be like definitive. This is the one way that the breakdown happens. They're just to illustrate that this is how the breakdown can happen. So on the left, the masculine experience. Imagine that the masculine feels cut off from the feminine. And in order to deal with that, the masculine asserts his dominance through force. The feminine then resents the masculine for trying to be oppressive, basically. And in that, the masculine is further cut off from the feminine. Because the masculine is cut off from the masculine tries to hoard or own feminine sexuality, and then the feminine further withdraws and the masculine is further cut off. This is a negative or a vicious cycle, and it's one that plays out in culture today. So that's kind of from the masculine side. The feminine side, another example of how this might work. Feminine is feeling cut off from the masculine. Feminine blames the masculine for what he did or didn't do. And in response to that, the masculine abandons the feminine, and the feminine is further cut off from the masculine. Because the feminine is cut off from the feminine tries to manipulate the masculine, and then the masculine becomes weaker and the feminine is further cut off from it. So again, this is not the only way it happens. This is kind of a stereotypical way, but the specifics of the information is here to illustrate the cycle. And the cycle is what really matters. Are we in a scarcity cycle where we're cutting each other off from masculine and feminine traits? Or are we able to step into an abundance cycle? So let's take a look at an abundance cycle, two abundance cycles. Again, the specifics are just here as an example to get the picture of how the cycle turns. So the masculine is feeling enlivened by the feminine. Because of that, the masculine provides direction and protection. Feminine, in that, feels safe to nurture life, And the masculine is nourished by this nurturing quality of the feminine. By being filled up and nourished, the masculine becomes devoted to feminine sexuality, and feminine abundance flows outward, which further enlivens the masculine. On the feminine side, feminine chooses the masculine. This makes the masculine more potent by being chosen by the feminine. In that, the feminine is fertilized by the masculinity. In that fertilization, the feminine uplifts and then further honors the masculine. The masculine creates order and structure based on being honored and uplifted, and then the feminine has more space to flourish. So the cycle here of masculine uplifting feminine and feminine uplifting masculine is virtuous. It's abundant. It's creative. And the more that feminine rises, the more the masculine is able to rise in turn. And in fact, the more that the masculine uplifts the feminine, the more that the masculine is uplifted in turn, and vice versa. So when we find these polarities, we then want to enter into the virtuous or abundant cycle of creation together in that polarity. There's another cycle around masculinity that I want to look at. And this is the human journey through the life cycle. So it's true that biologically we age and we go through different phases of, physical and social life, where we're a boy, and then an adolescent, and then an adult, and then an elder. But in addition to that, there are archetypal roles that we play. And these are on, remember, the causal layer of consciousness. These are kind of universal symbols that we can tap into. So the archetypes that go together with these stages of our development are the golden boy, the hero, the man, and the elder. Now, the way that archetypes work, or have worked in the past, based on our understanding of indigenous cultures who have rites of passage to move through these different archetypal stages, is that there's an initiation at each point. Children become initiated into adolescence, where the boy becomes initiated to become the hero. The hero then further becomes initiated to become a man, and then there's another rite of passage into elderhood. This is where men's work comes into play, and largely these initiations have been lost by our culture. So there are many authors out there, and I happen to agree with this, that the culture that we live in today, because we are in a modern scientific materialist worldview, we have part of the price that we've paid of that progress is that we've lost the spiritual and religious traditions that give us these rites of passage into the next archetype. And our culture is kind of stuck at the heroic level of consciousness. The hero is on a journey of self-becoming. He is out there for his own glory, and he is trying to slay his internal and external demons. Kind of culturally where we are. When we get to the man, that's the beginning of trans-egoic states of being, of stepping into an identity beyond the narrow self-interest of my ego and trying to perfect and secure my ego. The man, as an archetype, is responsible for others. He's a caretaker. He's one who is willing to sacrifice his own well-being and his own life for the sake of the greater good. The symbol that goes along with this initiation is called the willing sacrifice. So we need rites of passage and initiation to access these different archetypes. And a healthy civilization will have humans in every single one of these archetypes kind of distributed across the population. Right now, we're kind of stuck where we have people in adult bodies who are acting like children and adolescents. They have physically matured into manhood and into eldership, but at the archetypal level, which gives us meaning, who am I? What are my roles and responsibilities? We haven't stepped into the man and the elder. Part of the breakdown is that the roles of the elders in traditional culture is to shepherd these rites of passage and initiation. So for our culture, because nobody's advanced or very few people are advancing beyond the hero, we've lost elders, archetypal elders. And because we've lost archetypal elders, we don't have wisdom holders and initiators to help continue this cycle to move. So this is part of the challenge that we're faced today, and it's part of why men's work is so important. Because we are starting to tap back into this wisdom for how the cycle of life works to create a well-functioning and healthy civilization. Okay, so I've thrown out a bunch of ideas. Kind of want to pull it more together now. What is masculinity? So where I started from, masculinity is experienced through the heart's natural and innate recognition of the masculine. When you feel it, you know it. Yes, there are cultural constructions of masculinity, but in its essence, it is what is experienced as masculine by you. And that is this starting place of our own personal authority for our experience actually makes a huge difference. When we look at social theories of gender, most of them begin with the premise of oppression and masculinity's role in it. And as long as that's the core of where we're looking at masculinity from, we're never going to be able to move beyond the blame and victimization that comes with the core assumption of oppression. If we start with the core assumption of wholeness, the wholeness of life and masculinity as an expression of life, and then we're able to explain how it gets warped, because we don't have these rites of passages and other things that I'll talk about in my upcoming lectures, how oppression arises and how the wounding happens as a tool starting from wholeness. Then we also have the tools to bring that wounding back into healing. And that really is what we need, is not more blame or victimization around masculinity, but it's healing and wholeness. Okay. So we start with our own innate experience of masculinity. Looking more broadly, for me, masculinity is one member of a primal trinity of sexual diversification. It exists together with the feminine and the androgen. Masculinity contextually defines itself through polarity with the feminine. It's a morphic field. This is a term I haven't defined yet. It was created by a biologist named Rupert Sheldrake. Morphic field means a primal groove in consciousness. This primal groove in consciousness spans archetype, gender, and sex, meaning physiology. That one field of masculinity constellates, expresses through the many different expressions of gender and sexuality that we have. And it shows up kind of underlying or pervading all of them. In addition, this field evolves. It's not static. It evolves throughout the course of human history, through different cultures, across generations and individuals. So what it means to be a man today is different than what it meant to be a man a generation ago. So much has happened socially. So much has happened intersubjectively in the meaning making that we are collectively engaged in around this term masculinity. The identities, the roles, etc. So the field evolves, and it's held both within each of us individually, and it's also held collectively within a culture. Intersubjectively is the word. and this is my final point, its expression. So masculinity constellates uniquely within and between each individual. So my prior point that there is no universal trait for masculinity, this takes it even a step further, like how you experience masculinity is totally unique to you. And when we look at a morphic field that we all participate in, and that's constantly evolving, there's space for each one of us to have our own answer, our own truth, together with this one unifying theme that is the morphic field of masculinity. Space for both to be there. Check a question. Thanks for joining, Doug. Yeah. So to bring it all home, title of this whole thing is called The Organic Masculine, and that's my term. The Organic Masculine. So this core field of masculinity, which we're now like pinpointing here, it is life-affirming and sacred in the same way that all of life naturally moves towards the creation of life, in the same way that all of life is sacred. The organic masculine is an essential element for the flourishing of the human life cycle. If we try to disown, deconstruct, or otherwise get rid of masculinity, then it's not saying that we can't have a different kind of cycle, but the cycles that human civilizations have used throughout all of human history are no longer going to flow. And there's a lot of virtue that comes from having a flowing cycle, masculine polarizing with the feminine. So we want it if we can have it. Individuals and cultures mature through the masculine life cycle via rites of passage and initiation. When maturation stalls, the masculine becomes distorted, wounded, and oppressive. Stalled life cycles naturally move towards death, and then eventually through renewal. This is how life works. When we get stuck and we can't progress any further, we go into depression or we act out violently. That's kind of part of what's happening in the bigger picture for Western culture right now. We don't have a large-scale pathway to mature life stewarding roles of masculinity, and so we're stuck. However, in its healthy, mature state, masculinity is by his nature life-affirming. This is what I call the organic masculine. So I will take a pause here and open it up for questions or comments. See if there's anything that wants to come through. And feel free to just take yourself off mute at this point if you'd like. Alex, yes.
Thank you so much, Matt, for showing up and sharing your wisdom. Really beautiful. Enjoyed this a lot. I'm curious, a big theme of the loss of healthy masculinity in what you shared today, and in a lot of, like you said, a lot of the literature and thoughts around masculinity is the loss of these rites of passage. I'm curious, beyond that, what else you feel like has contributed to this loss of a sense of healthy masculinity in our societies, if anything?
Yeah. So it's not just initiations and rites of passage. We still do have some initiations. Like I grew up Catholic, I got confirmed.
Yep.
You know, we graduate from high school, we go get our diploma. That's a rite of passage. But
Yep.
what's missing is the experiential core. And when we look at what initiation really entails, it's death of the old and birth of the new. And it's full on. And this happens through contact with the sacred. So the last time that Western civilization really had direct experience of the sacred in like an organized collective way, I would say, was with the Eleusinian mysteries the mystery school in Greece, and that closed down in the 4th century of the Common Era. So it's been 1,500 years since we have had in our civilization a place where we're contacting the sacred. It's not that we need to know how to fix this. It's that by connecting with the sacred takes us. The natural wisdom of life helps us step into that. And so it's not just like the external forms of what the initiations are. It's that by ultimately moving into the modern age and all of the rational centric, benefits that came with that, we stripped away connection with the sacred.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, great question.
So that feels like a big leap between where we are and something that you're describing.
Yeah.
I don't want to do spoilers for your next talks, but is there a path to that?
Beautiful question. So we as a civilization are in crisis today. Probably the most pressing crisis is the environmental one. We're degrading ecosystems, climate change, that whole thing. It's time for us to act. And part of the issue is that we haven't known what to do. So we're starting, or at least I'm starting now, to bring forward, here's a viable solution. And what I would offer is that men's work, whether it happens in an ongoing men's group or by doing an intentional initiation, and there are many groups out there that do this, Mankind Project and Sacred Sons are probably the two most well-known. But my own experience of leading men's retreats over the last 4 or 5 years, it's like that, going on initiatory experiences as men is what we need to do. That's how we fix the process. We get the process flowing virtuously. So we change ourselves. We step into the organic version, the life-respecting, life-affirming version within ourselves, and then we start to share that out. And so each one of us who gets this becomes a beacon, and then we start to interconnect and collect, and we shine brighter and brighter collectively. And that's the vision moving forward. I'll say it's never too late either. The very first men's retreat that I led, I had one of the participants was a friend of mine. He was a successful business owner, married, had kids, retired, was a grandfather, all outward, checked all the boxes for lived a good life, was living a good life. Late 60s, early 70s, somewhere around there. He came and he had this experience, and we were doing the closing circle at the end, and he was crying. He said, I finally became a man. I didn't even know I was missing this. And just tears of joy and gratitude. And it's yeah, you got it. He got it. This is the experience that we want to share with each other in a good way. We want to uplift each other as brothers. Another question coming in the chat. I'm just going to read this out loud. I'm curious about your point about identifying the masculine in your heart. If I try to break free from any preconceived notion about what masculine and feminine are, how could I identify what is masculine and what is feminine during the introspective exercise? Wouldn't referring to, e.g., the archetype, introduce bias in my observations? Yeah, great question. So my point here is not that there are no right answers to masculinity. It's that there are no objectively, universally true definitions. I can't say, The masculine is always present, and that's true for all of us at all times. The feminine in many ways has presence. But the point is, when it arises as masculine in your experience, that's what's trustable. Follow that. So if for you, oh, here's this moment of incredible presence that feels masculine, yes, that's what we're going for. It's the recognition. And it doesn't come from the intellectual label. It arises from our experience first, from our heart in my language. And we go, oh, that, I get it. That's what we're looking for. Cool. You're welcome. Next question, Mick, interesting chart on page 14 about the virtuous cycle. Do you feel this dance or dynamic applies in relationships as well? Yes, relationship is the primary place where this dynamic unfolds or can unfold, whether it's the scarcity or the virtuous cycle. In relationship, between masculine or feminine, and in same-sex relationships, there's a different set of polarity that happens, and they may not use the language masculine and feminine. Full support, all good. Sometimes they do. I'm the more masculine one and they're the more feminine one. People find their own contextual relationship for how they polarize, but in that polarity, we're either uplifting each other or we're separating or pulling each other down. And relationship is the cauldron. That's where this really gets worked out.
But I'm trying to pose the question. I don't think I'm phrasing that correctly, but I'm going to try. We're talking about going back to the sacred, which to me, in my head, I'm thinking about the sacred is as a unity. So going back to it, asking what does masculine means?
Mm-hmm.
One of the who am I as a masculine? Is that one of the questions that
Sure.
can?
Yeah. So I don't have images on this of the divine masculine or the sacred masculine at the high causal level. But if you want to know what it means, start looking at different religious traditions and the icons that they use for the masculine version of the deity. Whether that's Jehovah or Shiva or whatever else, Odin, Zeus. And what we do is we take the universal symbol, and then our culture puts a description on top of it, and that becomes the myth. We interpret it for us. So, these are interpretations of the symbol of the divine androgyny. When you look at different myths for the divine masculine, what lies behind them, the essence beneath them, is the divine masculine, and that we can tune into.
Thank you.
Awesome. Great question. Okay. So last little piece here is this talk today is just kind of the foundation, like what is it that we're even talking about? Tomorrow's talk is called Integral Masculinities. And in that talk, masculinities, plural, we're going to be looking at different versions of how we experience masculinity through a developmental lens. And integral philosophy is a study of consciousness of how we view the world through different paradigms. Our worldview defines the world. Paradigm gives us the operating system for what we see and how we interpret it. So when we look through different lenses, we see different things for what it means to be masculine. So we're going to be looking at different flavors, different interpretations of masculinity using this developmental paradigm model from integral theory. And that's just going to flesh out more of how we get to know masculinity. In particular, for that one, the places where we judge, where we dissociate, where we blame, where we separate, those are the opportunities for us to do integration work and shadow work to come into more wholeness around masculinity or the feminine or the androgen. And so by looking at different frameworks for understanding masculinity, we get to do more work. We get to shine the spotlight on where I can come more into wholeness in myself. So that's where we're going next. My third talk, we're talking all about masculine archetypes. In particular, the four that are common in men's work are the magician, the warrior, the lover, and the king. So we'll be looking at those four. And then in my final talk, which happens on Thursday, we're going to be looking at men's work, what happens in men's work, why it's important, and how we can leverage it. So we just touched on it here today, but we'll be going deeper into what makes men's work good, what makes it effective, and why do we care? Cool. So with that, I just want to say thanks. Thank you for being in the conversation and bringing your presence and bringing your questions. A pleasure to get to share and to feel your engagement. So thank you. Beautiful.
Thank you, Matt.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you, brother.
Thanks very much, Matt.
Yeah, thanks a lot. I appreciated it.
Mm-hmm. You're welcome.